3 days without food will break most men. 5 days will make them see things that aren't there. But when Marcus Holloway stumbled through the pine trees on his 7th day, lost in the Colorado Rockies, what he found was real enough to save his life. An abandoned stone shelter, tucked into a granite outcrop like it had been waiting for him. Inside, he discovered not just the refuge he desperately needed, but something far more unsettling. Fresh coffee grounds, a journal with his name written inside, carvings on the walls that seemed to tell the story of his own life. The more Marcus recovered his strength, the more he realized this wasn't just luck or coincidence. Someone had prepared this place specifically for him. But who could have known he would be here, and how did they know so much about his past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Holloway had always been a man who planned for everything. In 34 years of teaching geology at the University of Colorado, he had never missed a class, never lost a student on a field expedition, and never left anything to chance. His colleagues often joked that Marcus could predict when a rock formation would shift by Tuesday at 3 o'clock. Yet here he was, 7 days into what should have been a simple 5-day solo hike, completely and utterly lost. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same man who had guided countless graduate students through treacherous mountain terrain, who had written 3 textbooks on Rocky Mountain geology, and who could read topographical maps like sheet music, had somehow wandered so far off course that his compass might as well have been pointing to Mars. His hiking map, now creased and worn from constant consultation, showed his planned route in neat red ink. The trail should have taken him in a comfortable loop from Bear Lake through Emerald Lake and back to the parking area. Simple, straightforward, foolproof. But nothing had been simple since Sarah died. Marcus pulled the map from his jacket pocket for perhaps the 100th time, his weathered fingers tracing the route he should have taken. The paper was soft now, almost fabric-like from handling, and stained with coffee from his thermos and sweat from his palms. Each crease told the story of his growing desperation over the past week. He had marked his actual path in pencil as best he could remember, creating a wandering line that bore no resemblance to his careful red route. The pencil marks showed a man walking in circles, doubling back, heading deeper into wilderness areas that weren't even on this particular map. 3 months ago, this kind of mistake would have been impossible. 3 months ago, Sarah would have been checking his pack, reminding him to bring extra batteries for his GPS, kissing him goodbye at the trailhead with that gentle smile that said she knew he'd be careful because he always was. 3 months ago, he had been a different man entirely. Dr. Marcus Holloway, respected professor emeritus, devoted husband of 32 years, steady as granite and twice as reliable. That man had died in room 314 of Presbyterian Medical Center on a Tuesday morning in July, holding his wife's hand as her breathing finally stopped. The man who stumbled through these mountains now was someone else entirely, someone who made careless mistakes, someone who forgot to charge his GPS, someone who walked for hours without paying attention to landmarks because his mind was trapped in a hospital room, replaying the sound of flatline monitors. Sarah had been his anchor, his true north. Without her steady presence, he had discovered something unsettling about himself. He was just as lost in his own home as he was in these mountains. Perhaps more so. At least here the confusion made sense. Here, being lost was a problem that could theoretically be solved with the right tools and enough persistence. At home, surrounded by 32 years of shared memories, the disorientation felt permanent. The hiking trip had been Dr. Peterson's idea. His family physician had suggested that some time in nature might help with what he diplomatically called the adjustment period. Marcus had initially resisted. Sarah had always been the one to suggest their weekend camping trips. Without her enthusiasm to drive the planning, the idea of heading into the wilderness alone felt more like exile than healing. But the alternative was spending another weekend wandering through their house, picking up objects that still carried her scent, sitting in rooms that echoed with conversations they would never finish. So he had planned this trip with his characteristic thoroughness. 5 days, moderate difficulty, well-marked trails. He had packed his gear with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. Enough food for 7 days, just in case. Water purification tablets, first aid kit, emergency shelter, signal mirror, everything by the book, everything Sarah would have approved of, everything except the attention span to actually follow his own plan. The first day had gone well enough. He had made good time to his first planned campsite and had even managed to eat something resembling a proper dinner. But somewhere during the night, lying in his tent and listening to the kind of deep mountain silence that Sarah had always loved, he had started thinking about the last camping trip they had taken together. 2 years ago, to this same general area, when she had already been feeling tired more often than usual, but before either of them suspected what that fatigue really meant. The next morning, he had packed up and started walking without really consulting his map. His feet had seemed to know where they wanted to go, following game trails and creek beds that felt familiar, chasing some half-remembered route from that final trip with Sarah. By the time he realized his mistake, the official trail was nowhere to be found, and his careful red line might as well have been drawn on a map of the moon. Now, looking at the evidence of his wandering, Marcus could see the pattern clearly. He hadn't been trying to follow his planned route at all. He had been trying to retrace those last steps with Sarah, to find some trail that would lead him back to her. Instead, he had found this shelter. The shelter had saved his life. But it was the journal that began to unravel his sanity. Marcus had spent his first hour inside the stone refuge, simply grateful to be alive. The structure was solid, built from fitted granite blocks that spoke of careful craftsmanship rather than emergency construction. Someone had taken considerable time to create this place, chinking the gaps with smaller stones and clay, installing a proper chimney that drew smoke efficiently from a small fire pit. The single room was perhaps 12 feet square, with a raised sleeping platform covered in what appeared to be relatively fresh pine boughs. It was only after he had rested for a while, allowing his body to begin recovering from a week of inadequate food and poor sleep, that he started to notice the details that didn't belong in an abandoned shelter. The coffee grounds were the first thing. Not just the existence of them, but their freshness. Marcus had spent enough early mornings in field camps to know what coffee smelled like after sitting for days or weeks. These grounds still held their rich aroma, suggesting they were perhaps hours old, certainly no more than a day or two. Someone had been here recently. Someone who drank the same dark roast blend that Marcus preferred, but it was the leather journal that truly disturbed him. He found it on the wooden shelf that had been built into the far wall, sitting openly, as if someone had just finished writing in it and stepped outside for a moment. The leather was worn smooth, the kind of patina that came from years of handling, and it was bound with a simple leather cord that reminded him of journals he had seen in gift shops near national parks. Nothing particularly unusual about it, except for the fact that it was there at all. Marcus opened it with the careful touch of someone accustomed to handling old documents and field notes. The handwriting was immediately familiar, though it took him a moment to understand why. The script was flowing and feminine, with the kind of careful letter formation that suggested someone who had been taught penmanship in an earlier era. It looked exactly like Sarah's handwriting. That was impossible, of course. Sarah had been dead for 3 months, and even if she weren't, she had never been to this shelter. Yet there it was, page after page of observations and reflections, written in script that could have been lifted from her grocery lists or the notes she used to leave him on the kitchen counter. The content was even more disturbing than the handwriting. The first entry was dated 6 months ago, which would have been during Sarah's final round of chemotherapy. It described a difficult day of treatment, the way the medication made everything taste like metal, the exhaustion that felt different from ordinary tiredness. These were details that Marcus remembered clearly, moments he had lived through alongside her, private struggles that no one else could have known about. "The doctors say we should talk about making arrangements," the entry read. "But how do you prepare someone you love for the fact that you're going to leave them completely lost?" Marcus felt his hands begin to shake. He remembered that conversation. It had taken place in their bedroom on a rainy Thursday evening in March. Sarah had been having a good day, her energy higher than it had been in weeks, and they had spent the afternoon working in her garden together. That evening, she had finally broached the subject they had both been avoiding. They had talked about funeral arrangements, about practical matters like insurance and bank accounts, about all the mundane details that death requires. But this journal entry captured not just the facts of that conversation, but Sarah's private thoughts about it. Thoughts she had never shared with him. "I know he thinks he's prepared," the entry continued. "Marcus always thinks he's prepared. He's made lists and researched everything and believes that knowledge will protect him from the worst of it. But he doesn't understand that losing someone isn't a problem you can solve with better preparation. It's a country you have to walk through, and everyone gets lost there for a while." The journal trembled in his hands as he read. Page after page contained observations about their life together, about his habits and fears, about conversations they had shared, and thoughts Sarah had never voiced aloud. Intimate details about their marriage, about her illness, about the way he arranged his coffee cup each morning, and how he unconsciously hummed while reading scientific papers. Someone had been watching them. Someone had been taking notes on their most private moments. But who could have gathered this information? And why would they want to? Marcus closed the journal and set it aside, but he could feel its presence like a weight in the room. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in scientific method and logical analysis, insisted there had to be an explanation. Perhaps Sarah had confided in someone during her treatment. Perhaps she had kept a journal herself that someone had copied. Perhaps his grief-addled mind was playing tricks on him, making him see connections that weren't really there. But the writing looked so much like hers, and the details were so precisely accurate. Marcus had always trusted in the reliability of magnetic north. In 34 years of fieldwork, his compass had never lied to him. It pointed north with the same unwavering consistency as sunrise, as predictable as the geological processes he had spent his career studying. But the hand-carved wooden compass he found tucked beneath the shelter's sleeping platform seemed to follow different rules entirely. The compass itself was beautiful in the way that only handmade objects could be. Someone had carved it from what appeared to be aspen wood, the grain flowing in smooth curves around the circular housing. The face was inlaid with tiny pieces of different woods, creating a mosaic of browns and golds that caught the light from the shelter's small window. Instead of the standard NESW markings, this compass bore symbols that looked vaguely Native American in origin, though Marcus couldn't identify their specific meaning. What troubled him was that the needle, rather than pointing north toward the magnetic pole, consistently pointed toward the back wall of the shelter. Marcus had tested it repeatedly, moving to different positions within the shelter, stepping outside, even walking several hundred yards down the slope. No matter where he stood, the ornate wooden needle swung back to point in the same direction, toward what appeared to be solid stone. He had checked it against his conventional compass multiple times. Magnetic north lay roughly 40 degrees to the left of where the wooden compass pointed. Yet the wooden instrument seemed as confident in its reading as his reliable metal one. Following the compass's guidance had led to his first major discovery. The back wall of the shelter, which had appeared to be nothing more than fitted stone blocks, actually concealed a narrow opening. It took him nearly an hour of careful examination to find the trigger mechanism, a particular stone that, when pressed, caused a section of the wall to swing inward on hidden hinges. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Even knowing where to look, the seam was nearly invisible when the door was closed. Beyond the hidden entrance lay a small storage chamber, perhaps 4 feet square, and tall enough for him to stand upright. The space had been carved directly from the granite bedrock, the walls smooth and dry despite the mountain's frequent moisture. Someone had lined the floor with flat stones to create a level surface, and built wooden shelves along two walls. The shelves held treasures that made no sense. There were photographs of him that he didn't remember posing for. Pictures of him teaching in classrooms he recognized, but taken from angles that suggested someone had been present without his knowledge. A photo of him and Sarah at their favorite restaurant, taken from across the room during what he remembered as a private anniversary dinner 2 years ago. Another showing him working in his home office, shot through what must have been their kitchen window. Someone had been watching them for years. Mixed among the photographs were personal items that should have been impossible for anyone else to possess. A ticket stub from a concert he and Sarah had attended in Denver, a ticket he distinctly remembered throwing away months ago. A pressed flower that looked exactly like one Sarah had picked during a hike they had taken to Blue Lake. A flower he had watched her place between the pages of a poetry book that still sat on their bedside table at home. A napkin from the coffee shop where they had first met 34 years ago, somehow preserved despite the decades. But perhaps most unsettling was the collection of small carved wooden animals arranged on the top shelf. Each figure was no larger than his thumb, carved with the same skilled hands that had created the compass. A tiny wooden bear, a mountain goat, an eagle with outstretched wings, a fox with its tail curled around its feet. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each animal capturing not just the basic form, but something essential about the creature's spirit. Marcus recognized them immediately. They were perfect replicas of the animal carvings that Sarah had collected over the years, small sculptures she had purchased from various artisans during their travels together. The originals still sat on the mantelpiece in their living room, arranged in the exact same order as these miniature copies. Someone had not only been watching them, but had been replicating the intimate details of their shared life with obsessive precision. The wooden compass hadn't been pointing randomly at the back wall. It had been guiding him to this hidden gallery of surveillance, the shrine to his own existence that someone had built in the depths of a mountain shelter. As Marcus stood in the small chamber, surrounded by evidence of years of observation, the wooden compass in his hand continued to point steadily in its chosen direction. But now he realized it wasn't pointing at the wall anymore. It was pointing deeper into the mountain, suggesting there were more secrets waiting to be discovered, more impossible revelations about his life that someone had catalogued and preserved in this remote place. The compass seemed to be inviting him to follow where it led, to discover what other impossibilities lay hidden in the stone around him. The boots were still warm. Marcus discovered them on his third morning in the shelter, tucked beneath a makeshift bench near the fire pit. They were sturdy hiking boots, well worn but carefully maintained, the kind of footwear that spoke of serious mountain experience. The leather had been treated recently with waterproofing compound, and the laces were new, despite the boots themselves showing years of use. What stopped Marcus cold was that when he touched them, they radiated the faint heat of someone who had just taken them off. He jerked his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Someone else was here. Someone who had been wearing these boots recently enough that body heat still lingered in the leather. Someone who might be watching him even now. Marcus stepped to the shelter's small window and peered out into the morning forest. Pine trees stretched in all directions, their branches heavy with the previous night's frost. Nothing moved except the occasional flutter of a bird or the gentle sway of branches in the mountain breeze. But somewhere out there, someone was walking around in stocking feet or had another pair of boots. Someone who knew Marcus was here and had deliberately left evidence of their presence. The boots were at least 2 sizes larger than Marcus's own feet. Size 12, maybe 13, suggesting a man of considerable height. The wear patterns on the soles told their own story. This person favored his right foot slightly, had a tendency to strike heel first on downhill sections and had spent significant time walking on rocky terrain. Marcus found himself analyzing the boots with the same methodical attention he had once brought to rock formations. Reading the story written in worn leather and compressed foam, inside the right boot. Tucked into the toe, he found a small piece of paper. The note was written in block letters, the kind of careful printing someone might use to disguise their handwriting. It contained just 4 words: "You're not alone here." Marcus felt the shelter's walls close in around him. For 3 days, he had been operating under the assumption that whatever mystery surrounded this place, it was at least a static puzzle he could solve at his own pace. The journal, the photographs, the carved animals, all were evidence of past observation, historical surveillance that was unsettling but not immediately threatening. But these boots changed everything. They meant someone was actively present, moving around the shelter while he slept, close enough to leave notes and warm footwear. The rational part of his mind insisted on considering benign explanations. Perhaps this was simply another lost hiker who had been using the shelter and was trying to avoid frightening him. Maybe the person was as confused by Marcus's presence as Marcus was by theirs. The note could be interpreted as reassurance rather than threat, a way of saying he wasn't abandoned in the wilderness, but Marcus's survival instincts, honed by decades of leading student expeditions into remote areas, were screaming warnings. Someone with innocent intentions would have introduced themselves directly. Someone who meant no harm wouldn't communicate through cryptic notes left in hidden boots. Someone who had nothing to hide wouldn't move around the shelter like a ghost, leaving only traces of their presence. Over the next several hours, Marcus began to notice other signs he had previously overlooked. The fire pit contained ashes that were only a day or 2 old, far more recent than he had initially assumed. The wood pile beside the shelter had been recently replenished, with several logs that showed fresh axe marks. Most telling of all, the food supplies he had found and gratefully consumed had been arranged in a way that suggested regular maintenance. Someone had been keeping this shelter stocked and ready, not for general use by passing hikers, but for a specific purpose. As evening approached, Marcus made a decision that went against every instinct he had developed during his years in the mountains. Instead of settling in for another night in the shelter, he gathered his gear and moved to a position about 50 yards away, concealed among a stand of pine trees where he could observe the shelter without being seen. If someone was indeed sharing this space with him, he wanted to see who it was and what they were doing. The vigil required patience he wasn't sure he possessed. His body was still recovering from a week of poor nutrition and stress, and the mountain air held the sharp bite of coming winter. But as the sun set behind the western peaks and darkness settled over the forest, Marcus found himself driven by a curiosity stronger than his physical discomfort. He wanted to know who had been expecting him, who had filled that journal with Sarah's most private thoughts, who had been documenting his life with such intimate precision, and most importantly, what they wanted from him now that he was here, the answers he suspected would come with whoever filled those still warm boots. The old man emerged from the forest like a figure from another century. Marcus had been watching the shelter for nearly 6 hours when movement finally caught his eye. At first, it was just a shadow shifting among the trees, so subtle he almost dismissed it as wind-stirred branches. But then the shadow detached itself from the darkness and resolved into the shape of a tall, lean figure moving with the careful quiet of someone who had spent a lifetime in wild places. The man was older than Marcus had expected, perhaps in his 70s, with shoulder-length grey hair and a beard that reached nearly to his chest. He wore clothes that looked handmade, leather pants, and a wool shirt that seemed to belong to an earlier era. Most striking of all was the camera that hung from a strap around his neck, an old Polaroid model that Marcus recognized as the kind that had been popular decades ago. The stranger moved to the shelter with obvious familiarity, producing a key from somewhere in his clothing and unlocking a door that Marcus hadn't even realized could be locked. He disappeared inside for perhaps 20 minutes, during which Marcus could see the warm glow of lamplight through the small window. When he emerged, he was carrying the camera in his hands, checking something on its back panel with the focused attention of someone preparing to take photographs. That was when Marcus made his decision to reveal himself. "I know you're out there," the old man called out without looking in Marcus's direction. His voice carried the kind of authority that comes from absolute confidence. "You might as well come down. We have things to discuss." Marcus felt his stomach drop. So much for his carefully concealed position. He stood slowly, brushing pine needles from his jacket, and walked down the slope toward the shelter. As he approached, the old man turned to face him, and Marcus found himself looking into eyes that seemed to hold decades of mountain wisdom. "You're Ezra," Marcus said, though he had no idea where the name came from. The old man smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features into something unexpectedly gentle. "I am. And you're Marcus Holloway, retired professor of geology, recently widowed, currently lost in more ways than one." He held up the Polaroid camera. "I've been documenting your journey. My journey started a week ago when I got lost." "No," Ezra said quietly. "Your journey started 3 months ago when Sarah died. Everything since then has been leading you here." He gestured to the camera. "I have photographs that prove it." With practiced movements, Ezra began pulling developed Polaroid pictures from various pockets in his clothing. The images were startling in their clarity and impossible timing. Marcus hiking through terrain he recognized from his first day on the trail. Marcus sitting by his campfire on the second night, looking lost and dejected. Marcus stumbling through the forest on his 6th day, clearly disoriented and exhausted. "How did you take these?" Marcus asked, studying a photo that showed him from perhaps 30 feet away, taken during what he had thought was complete solitude. "I've been following you since you left the trailhead," Ezra replied matter-of-factly. "Sarah asked me to watch over you, to make sure you found your way here safely." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Sarah never met you. Sarah never came to these mountains without me." Ezra pulled another photograph from his shirt pocket, this one clearly older, the colors slightly faded. It showed Sarah sitting on a fallen log near what Marcus now recognized as the shelter, deep in conversation with a younger version of Ezra. Sarah was wearing the blue jacket she had loved, the one that had hung in their closet for months after her death because Marcus couldn't bear to give it away. "She came here last spring," Ezra said gently, "during one of those weekends when you thought she was visiting her sister in Denver. She was already very sick, but she had something important to arrange." Marcus felt the world tilt around him. Sarah had lied to him. In the final months of her life, when every moment had been precious, she had spent time with this stranger in a place Marcus had never known existed. The betrayal cut deeper than any of the other mysteries he had encountered. "She knew she was dying," Ezra continued, "and she knew how hard her death would be on you. She asked me to prepare this place, to make it ready for the day when your grief would finally drive you to seek solitude in the mountains. She knew you would get lost. She knew you would need somewhere safe to fall apart and put yourself back together." Ezra lowered the camera and looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "Everything you've found here, every impossible coincidence, every piece of evidence that someone has been watching your life, it all comes from her. Sarah prepared this place as her final gift to you, a place where you could grieve safely and find your way back to living." The cave paintings were older than anything Marcus had expected to find in these mountains, yet they told a story he recognized with painful clarity. Ezra led him through a narrow passage behind the shelter that Marcus had never noticed, despite his thorough exploration of the area. The entrance was concealed behind what appeared to be a natural rockfall, but once they squeezed through the opening, the passage widened into a cavern large enough to stand upright. Ezra produced an old kerosene lantern from somewhere in his seemingly endless collection of gear, and the warm light revealed walls covered in paintings that took Marcus's breath away. The artwork was clearly ancient, painted in the red ochre and charcoal pigments that Marcus recognized from his geological studies of prehistoric sites. But these weren't the typical hunting scenes or animal spirits he might have expected from Native American cave art. Instead, the paintings told the story of two people, a man and a woman, depicted in a series of scenes that chronicled their life together from young adulthood through old age. The style was primitive, but powerfully expressive. The figures were rendered in simple, flowing lines that somehow captured not just their physical forms, but something essential about their relationship. In the early scenes painted near the cave entrance, the couple was shown walking together, working side by side, sharing meals around a fire. Their body language spoke of companionship and mutual support, the kind of easy partnership that develops over many years. As the paintings progressed deeper into the cave, the story began to change. The woman's figure became smaller, more fragile, while the man's posture showed increasing worry and protective tenderness. Marcus found himself following the narrative with growing recognition, seeing in these ancient figures the same arc that he and Sarah had traveled during her illness. "How old are these?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper in the enclosed space. "The cave paintings." "Perhaps 1,000 years old, maybe more," Ezra replied, holding the lantern higher to illuminate a particularly detailed scene. "But the story they tell is much older than that, and much more recent." The painting Ezra was highlighting showed the woman lying still while the man knelt beside her, his body curved in an attitude of profound grief. Even rendered in simple pigments on stone, the image conveyed a sense of loss so immediate that Marcus felt his chest tighten with recognition. "This is what happened to you," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Ezra nodded slowly. "My wife Elena died in these mountains 43 years ago. We were both younger then, more adventurous, perhaps more foolish. A late-season storm caught us unprepared, and she developed pneumonia that we couldn't treat in the wilderness. I carried her to this cave, thinking the shelter might help her recover, but—" He paused, his weathered hand touching the painted figure gently. "She died in my arms, just like the woman in this ancient story." They continued deeper into the cave, following the painted narrative to its conclusion. The final scenes showed the surviving man alone, wandering through landscapes that became increasingly desolate and empty. But then, in the very deepest part of the cave, the story took an unexpected turn. The man was shown building something, creating a structure with careful hands. Other figures appeared, people who seemed lost or broken, and the man was offering them shelter and guidance. The ancient artist understood something that took me years to learn, Ezra said, setting the lantern down near the final painting. "Grief can either destroy you or transform you into something useful to others who are walking the same path. The man in these paintings chose transformation. Eventually, so did I." Marcus studied the last image, which showed the man standing before what was unmistakably the shelter above them, welcoming a figure who was clearly meant to represent another lost soul. "You've been helping other people deal with grief?" "For 40 years, Ezra confirmed. "People find their way here when they're ready, usually without knowing they're looking for this place." Sarah understood that. She recognized the pattern because she had studied you so carefully. She knew that eventually your grief would drive you into the mountains, and she knew you would need more than just solitude to heal. The cave paintings seemed to pulse in the lamplight, their simple figures alive with movement and emotion. Marcus realized he was looking at more than just ancient art, or even Ezra's personal history. He was seeing a pattern that had repeated itself across centuries, a cycle of loss and healing that connected him to countless others who had walked this same path. "Sarah didn't just prepare the shelter," Marcus said, understanding beginning to dawn. "She was connecting me to something larger." Ezra smiled, the expression visible in the warm glow of the lantern. "She was ensuring that your grief would become part of an ancient tradition of transformation." that your loss would eventually help others find their way through their own darkness. The paintings watched from the cave walls, silent witnesses to a story that was both deeply personal and universally human. Sarah's wedding ring was embedded in the cave wall, like it had been waiting there for 1,000 years. Marcus saw it glinting in the lamplight as they prepared to leave the painted chamber, a small circle of gold that seemed to pulse with its own inner fire among the ancient pigments. At first, he thought his grief-stricken mind was playing tricks on him, creating familiar shapes in the random patterns of mineral deposits that often decorated cave walls. But as he moved closer, there was no mistaking the simple gold band that had circled Sarah's finger for 32 years. "That's impossible," he whispered, reaching toward the wall with trembling fingers. The ring was set into the stone as if it had been placed there when the cave paintings were first created, the rock having grown around it over centuries. But Marcus knew every scratch and imperfection on that band. He had placed it on Sarah's finger during their wedding ceremony in 1992, had watched it catch the light during countless everyday moments, had reluctantly removed it from her still hand in the hospital 3 months ago. How? The word came out as barely a breath. Ezra set the lantern down and studied Marcus's face with the careful attention of someone who had guided many people through difficult revelations. "What do you remember about the day Sarah died?" The question seemed to come from a great distance. Marcus felt himself transported back to that sterile hospital room, to the sound of machines and the antiseptic smell that had become the backdrop to their final weeks together. She was sleeping. The morphine made her sleep most of the time toward the end. I was holding her hand, and then the monitors started that continuous tone, and the nurses came in. What happened to her ring? Marcus closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember details he had tried to forget. The nurse asked if I wanted to remove her jewelry before. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. I took off her wedding ring and her watch. I put them in the bag with her other personal effects, and then I brought them home. They're still in the bag. I couldn't bear to look at them, so I put the whole thing in our bedroom closet. Marcus opened his eyes and stared at the ring embedded in the ancient stone. But this looks exactly like Sarah's ring. Every scratch, every tiny dent from where she knocked it against the kitchen counter. Ezra reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather pouch, the kind that might be used to carry coins or other small valuables. He opened it carefully and extended it toward Marcus. "Look inside." The pouch contained a wedding ring. Marcus lifted it with fingers that felt numb, studying it in the lamplight. It was identical to the one in the cave wall, down to the smallest imperfection. Same size, same wear patterns, same tiny inscription on the inside band that read forever. M&S. "I don't understand," Marcus said, though a terrible possibility was beginning to form in his mind. "Sarah came here 6 months before she died," Ezra said gently. "She was already very weak, but she insisted on making the journey. She told me she had something that needed to be placed with the ancient paintings, something that would help you understand when the time came." Marcus felt the world shifting around him like loose scree on a mountain slope. "She placed her ring in the cave wall?" "She said it needed to become part of the story," Ezra replied. "Part of the eternal cycle of love and loss that these paintings represent. She wanted you to find it here, in this sacred place, so you would understand that your love for her was connected to something larger and older than either of your individual lives." The implications crashed over Marcus like an avalanche. Sarah had known she was dying months before she had told him. While he was researching treatment options and consulting with specialists, she had been planning this elaborate farewell. She had somehow found Ezra, arranged for the shelter to be prepared, and made this pilgrimage to place her ring among ancient symbols of enduring love. "The ring in our bedroom," Marcus said slowly. "A replacement," Ezra confirmed. "Sarah had it made by the same jeweler who created the original. She wanted you to have something to bury with her, something that would give you comfort during the funeral." But she wanted the real ring to remain here, in this place of transformation, waiting for you to find it when you were ready to understand her final message. Marcus looked from the ring in his hand to the one embedded in the cave wall, two identical symbols that represented the same love but different stages of understanding. The ring he held was about possession, about holding on to what was lost. The ring in the wall was about connection, about love that transcended individual loss and became part of something eternal. "She knew I would come here," he said. "She knew grief would drive you to seek solitude in the mountains," Ezra corrected. "And she trusted that when you were ready, you would find your way to where love goes when it can no longer be contained in a single life." The medicine bundle felt heavy with more than just its physical weight when Ezra placed it in Marcus's hands, wrapped in soft deerskin and tied with sinew. The bundle contained herbs and objects that Ezra explained had been gathered over decades from these sacred mountains. Each item had been chosen for its spiritual significance, its ability to facilitate the kind of deep healing that went beyond the physical realm. As Marcus carefully unwrapped the bundle in the lamplight of the cave, he found himself looking at things that seemed to belong to an older understanding of grief and recovery. "This ceremony has been performed in this place for longer than either of us can imagine," Ezra said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing ancient wisdom. "The paintings on these walls show it. The indigenous people who first found this cave understood that some kinds of healing require ritual, require the deliberate transformation of pain into something useful. The bundle contained sage that had been dried and braided into tight spirals, cedar bark that released a sweet, resinous scent when touched, and small pouches of what Ezra identified as sweetgrass and tobacco. There were also objects that spoke of more personal significance, a piece of granite from the mountain above them, worn smooth by countless hands, a feather from a golden eagle that had died naturally and been found near the shelter, and a small carved figure that Marcus recognized as similar to the wooden animals he had discovered in the hidden chamber. "Sarah helped me prepare this bundle," Ezra said quietly. "During her visit here, she spent hours gathering some of these materials herself. She wanted to be part of the ceremony that would eventually help you heal, even though she knew she wouldn't be here to guide you through it." Marcus felt the weight of that revelation settle over him. Even in her final months, weakened by chemotherapy and facing her own mortality, Sarah had been thinking about his future healing. She had climbed these mountains, gathered sacred plants, and participated in the preparation of a ritual designed to help him move beyond the paralyzing grip of grief. "What does the ceremony involve?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew that the question itself represented a commitment. By asking, he was acknowledging that he was ready to participate in something that would fundamentally change his relationship with his loss. "It begins with releasing what you've been carrying," Ezra explained, settling cross-legged on the cave floor. "All the guilt, all the regret, all the ways you've been punishing yourself for surviving when she didn't. Those have to be acknowledged and then consciously let go." Marcus found himself thinking about the months since Sarah's death, the way he had withdrawn from friends and colleagues, the way he had stopped taking care of himself properly, the way he had begun each day with a mental inventory of all the things he should have done differently during her illness. The weight of that self-imposed burden felt enormous now that he was being asked to consider releasing it. "Then comes the harder part," Ezra continued, "accepting that love doesn't end with death, it just changes form. Sarah's love for you is still present, but it's no longer contained in her physical being. It's become part of the mountain, part of the air you breathe, part of the wisdom you carry forward. The ceremony helps you learn to access that love in its new form." The medicine bundle seemed to pulse with potential in Marcus's hands. He could feel the intention that had gone into its preparation, the careful selection of each element, the prayers and hopes that Sarah and Ezra had woven into its creation. This wasn't just a collection of plants and stones. It was a tool designed specifically for his healing, crafted with intimate knowledge of his particular kind of pain. "There's no going back once we begin," Ezra warned. "The ceremony will change. How you understand your relationship with Sarah, how you understand your own purpose moving forward. You'll still miss her, but the quality of that missing will be different. Instead of an absence that diminishes you, it will become a presence that empowers you." Marcus looked around the cave, at the ancient paintings that depicted the eternal cycle of love and loss, at the golden ring that caught the lamplight from its place in the stone wall, at Ezra's weathered face that showed the peace that could come after decades of carrying transformed grief. Everything in this sacred place had been leading to this moment, this choice between remaining trapped in loss or accepting the invitation to healing that Sarah had prepared for him. He thought about the man who had entered these mountains a week ago, lost in more ways than geographic. That man had been hollow, going through the motions of living while feeling fundamentally disconnected from any sense of purpose or joy. The ceremony offered the possibility of becoming someone different, someone who could carry Sarah's love forward in a way that honored both her memory and his own continuing life. "I'm ready," Marcus said, and felt the words settle into the cave like a prayer. The crystal formation rose from the cave floor like a natural altar, its faceted surfaces catching and multiplying the lamplight into thousands of tiny stars. Marcus had not noticed the crystals during their earlier exploration of the cave, but now, as Ezra arranged the contents of the medicine bundle around its base, the formation seemed to pulse with an inner light that had nothing to do with the kerosene. Flame! The crystals were clear quartz, formed over millennia by mineral-rich water seeping through the mountain's granite heart. They created a natural amphitheater perhaps 3 feet across, with the largest crystal pointing toward the cave ceiling like a compass needle aimed at the stars. "Every person who has performed this ceremony has used this same altar," Ezra said, his voice taking on the reverent tone of someone who understood the sacred nature of what they were about to undertake. "The crystals hold the energy of all those transformations, all those moments when someone chose healing over despair." Ezra began the ceremony by lighting the braided sage, its smoke rising in spirals that seemed to dance around the crystal points. The scent was earthy and clean, carrying with it something that felt like ancient wisdom. He added cedar bark to the small fire he had built in a natural depression near the crystals, and the sweet smoke mingled with the sage to create an atmosphere that felt removed from ordinary time and space. "Speak to her," Ezra said simply. "Tell Sarah what you've been carrying." At first, Marcus felt foolish talking to empty air, but as the smoke from the burning herbs filled the cave and the crystals seemed to amplify every whispered word, he found himself speaking truths he had never voiced aloud. "I'm angry at you," he said, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the small fire. "I'm angry that you left me. I'm angry that you planned all of this without telling me. I'm angry that you were preparing for my life after you were gone, when I wanted you to focus on fighting to stay." The words hung in the smoke-filled air, and Marcus realized that acknowledging his anger felt like removing a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. For months, he had told himself that anger at a dying person was unacceptable, that he should feel only love and gratitude for their time together. But the truth was more complicated than that. As the ceremony continued, guided by Ezra's quiet prompts and the hypnotic play of light on crystal, Marcus found himself speaking other truths. He talked about his guilt at feeling relieved when Sarah's suffering finally ended. He admitted his fear that he would forget important details about their life together. He confessed his terror at the prospect of living the rest of his life without her guidance and companionship. "Now," Ezra said when Marcus had emptied himself of words, "listen." In the silence that followed, something extraordinary began to happen. The crystals seemed to vibrate with a frequency just below the threshold of hearing, and Marcus felt a presence in the cave that was unmistakably Sarah. Not a ghost or hallucination, but something more subtle and more real. The quality of love he had known for 32 years, present now in a form that transcended physical existence. "I prepared this place because I knew you would blame yourself." Her voice seemed to whisper from the crystal formation itself. "I knew you would think there was something more you could have done, some way you could have saved me. But my dying wasn't your failure, Marcus. It was just the next chapter in our story." Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, but they were different from the tears he had shed during the months of grief. These tears felt cleansing rather than desperate, a release rather than a manifestation of loss. "I need you to live," Sarah's presence continued. "Not just survive, but truly live. Find joy again. Help other people the way Ezra helped you. Let our love become something larger than just our marriage." The ceremony reached its crescendo as Ezra guided Marcus through the ritual burning of the journal entries, the photographs, and other physical reminders of the mystery that had brought him to this place. As each item turned to ash in the sacred fire, Marcus felt himself letting go of the need to hold on to Sarah in the old way. He was learning to carry her love forward instead of being paralyzed by her absence. When the last of the artifacts had been consumed by the flames, the crystal formation seemed to pulse once more with brilliant light, and Marcus felt a fundamental shift in his understanding of what it meant to love someone who had died. The love was still there, as strong as ever, but it was no longer a source of pain. It had become a source of strength. "The ceremony is complete," Ezra said softly, but Marcus already knew. He could feel the change in himself, the way grief had, transformed into something that would enable him to help others, rather than diminish his own capacity for living. The crystals gradually returned to their normal appearance, but Marcus knew he would never forget the way they had served as a conduit for the most important conversation of his life. The new trail map that Ezra pressed into Marcus's hands was nothing like the worn, creased hiking map that had failed to guide him to this place. This map was hand-drawn on heavy paper that felt almost like parchment, created with the careful attention of someone who had walked every trail and knew every landmark intimately. Unlike the mass-produced topographical map that showed only elevation, lines, and official trail markers, this one included details that spoke of lived experience. Springs that ran year-round were marked with tiny blue spirals. Areas where wildlife gathered were indicated with small sketched animals. Shelter locations, both official and hidden, were marked with symbols that looked like tiny houses. Most importantly, this map showed a clear route down from the sacred cave to the main trail system, and from there back to the world Marcus had left behind a week ago. "This is your way home," Ezra said, watching as Marcus studied the carefully rendered pathways. "But it's also your way back here, whenever you need to return." Marcus traced the route with his finger, noting how Ezra had marked not just the physical landmarks, but also the spiritual significance of various locations. There was a grove of aspen trees marked as Place of Memory, a rocky overlook designated as Point of Decision, and a meadow labeled simply Where Joy Returns. This wasn't just a navigation tool, it was a guide for the continuation of his healing journey. "You've been drawing maps like this for other people," Marcus realized. "For 40 years, Ezra confirmed. "Everyone who completes the ceremony receives a map. Not just to help them find their way back to ordinary life, but to remind them that they now have a responsibility to help others who are walking the same path of grief and recovery." The weight of that responsibility settled over Marcus like a warm cloak rather than a burden. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own healing. The ceremony in the crystal cave had transformed his grief from something that diminished him into something that could be useful to others. The map represented his invitation to carry that transformation forward. "What do I do when I get back?" Marcus asked. "You live," Ezra said simply. "You return to your life, but you live it differently. You watch for other people who are lost in the way you were lost. When you encounter someone trapped in grief, someone who has forgotten how to hope, you find a way to guide them toward healing, not necessarily to this place, but toward whatever form of ceremony or ritual or community will help them transform their pain into wisdom." Marcus folded the map carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket next to his heart. The paper felt warm against his chest, as if it carried some of the energy from the sacred cave where his transformation had taken place. "Will I see you again?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "When you're ready to bring someone else here," Ezra replied. "When you encounter someone whose grief can only be healed by this particular ceremony in this particular place, the mountain will guide you back to me when the time comes." They spent Marcus's final morning at the shelter in practical preparations for his return journey. Ezra packed food and water that would sustain him during the day-long hike back to the official trail system. He showed Marcus how to recognize the landmarks on the hand-drawn map, how to read the natural signs that would keep him oriented during the descent, but perhaps more importantly, they talked about the life Marcus would build when he returned to civilization. He would go back to his empty house, but he wouldn't be the same broken man who had left it a week ago. He would carry Sarah's love forward in a new form, as a capacity to recognize and help others who were struggling with profound loss. "The shelter will remain ready," Ezra said, as Marcus shouldered his pack for the final time. "Whenever someone needs it, whenever the mountain calls to someone who is ready for transformation, this place will be here." Marcus took one last look around the stone refuge that had saved his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The journal was gone now, burned in the ceremony, but its lessons remained part of him. The photographs and carved animals had been transformed into ash and memory, but their message about the continuity of love had become part of his understanding. Even the boots that had first alerted him to Ezra's presence seemed less mysterious now, simply the practical footwear of a man who had dedicated his life to helping lost souls find their way. As Marcus began his descent down the mountain, following the route marked on Ezra's carefully drawn map, he carried with him not just the memory of his time in the shelter, but a new sense of mission. Sarah's final gift had been more than just a place to grieve safely. It had been an initiation into a calling that would give the rest of his life meaning and purpose. Marcus's old compass had been pointing true north for 34 years, but when he pulled it from his pack at the trailhead parking lot, it felt like an artifact from another life. The small metal instrument had guided him through countless field expeditions, helped him teach thousands of students the basics of wilderness navigation, and had never once failed to show him the way home. Its needle still swung to magnetic north with the same reliable precision it had always displayed. But standing beside his dusty truck in the late afternoon sun, Marcus realized that true direction had nothing to do with compass readings. The parking lot was exactly as he had left it 8 days ago, his vehicle sitting in the same spot where Sarah would have dropped him off if she had been alive to make the drive. Other hikers were loading their gear, families were organizing coolers and camping equipment, and the whole scene carried the familiar rhythm of people returning from wilderness adventures. But Marcus felt like he was observing it all from a great distance, a man who had traveled much farther than the 23 miles his GPS showed between the trailhead and the sacred shelter. The drive home took him through small mountain towns that looked unchanged, past landscapes that should have felt familiar but somehow seemed different now. He stopped for coffee at a diner where he and Sarah had often eaten during their weekend trips, and found himself studying the other customers with new eyes. An elderly man sitting alone at a corner booth, methodically working through a piece of pie, caught his attention. Something in the man's posture spoke of recent loss, the careful way he held himself that Marcus now recognized as the body language of grief. 6 months ago, Marcus would have noticed nothing beyond the man's desire for solitude. Now, guided by insights gained in the sacred cave, he found himself approaching the stranger's table. "Excuse me," Marcus said gently. "I don't mean to intrude, but I wondered if you'd like some company." The man looked up with eyes that confirmed Marcus's intuition. Here was someone walking through the same country of loss that Marcus had inhabited for 3 months. They talked for an hour over coffee, the stranger sharing the story of his wife's recent death, his struggle with the emptiness of their shared home, his feeling that he had somehow lost the ability to navigate his own life. Marcus listened with the kind of attention that grief had taught him, and when the conversation reached its natural conclusion, he found himself offering something he couldn't have imagined saying a week earlier. "There's a place in the mountains," Marcus said, pulling Ezra's hand-drawn map from his pocket. "If you ever feel like you need to get away, to think things through in a different setting, this might help." He sketched the basic route to the shelter on a napkin, including enough landmarks to make the journey possible for someone who was ready to find it. The man studied the rough directions with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was being offered more than just hiking advice. When Marcus finally arrived at his own house, the familiarity of his driveway and front door felt both comforting and strange. The key still fit the lock. The room still held the accumulated treasures of 32 years of marriage, and Sarah's coffee cup still sat in the kitchen sink where he had left it the morning of his departure. But he moved through the spaces differently now, less like a ghost haunting scenes of former happiness, and more like someone preparing to create new memories. The compass sat on his kitchen table as he unpacked his gear, its needle steady and true. Marcus picked it up one final time, noting how the weight felt different in his hands. For 3 decades, this instrument had represented his primary relationship with direction and purpose. It had told him where he was going and how to get back to where he had started. But the journey to the shelter had taught him that the most important kind of navigation couldn't be measured in degrees from magnetic north. True direction came from understanding how to transform personal experience into service to others, how to let love guide movement through the world, rather than simply following predetermined routes. Marcus placed the compass in a drawer with other mementos from his teaching career, instruments that had served their purpose but were no longer essential tools. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of building a different kind of life, one guided not by magnetic attraction, but by the recognition of others who were struggling to find their own way through the wilderness of loss. The compass would remain in the drawer, pointing steadily north, while Marcus learned to navigate by different stars entirely. His direction now would be determined by the needs of people like the man in the diner, souls who were ready for the kind of transformation that could only happen when someone cared enough to offer guidance toward healing. Sarah's gardening gloves still held the shape of her hands when Marcus found them 3 weeks after his return from the mountain. He discovered them while cleaning out the garden shed, a task he had been avoiding since her death, but now felt ready to undertake. The gloves were tucked behind a bag of fertilizer, forgotten in the rush of her final months when gardening had become too difficult and the shed had been left largely untouched. The leather was soft and worn, molded to the specific contours of Sarah's fingers, and when Marcus picked them up, he could almost feel her presence in the familiar curves and creases. For a moment, the old grief threatened to return. These gloves represented all the springs they would never share, all the flower beds Sarah would never tend, all the quiet conversations they had enjoyed while working side by side in the soil. But as Marcus held them in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the shed window, he felt something different from the paralyzing loss that had once overwhelmed him. Instead of absence, he felt invitation. The garden itself had suffered during his months of neglect. Weeds had claimed the vegetable beds Sarah had planned so carefully, and the perennial flowers she had loved were struggling beneath an invasion of crabgrass and dandelions. The whole space looked abandoned, a testament to how grief had caused him to stop caring for the things that had once brought them both joy. Marcus pulled on Sarah's gloves, surprised to find that they fit reasonably well despite being designed for smaller hands. The leather felt warm and familiar, as if it remembered not just Sarah's touch, but the countless hours they had spent working together in this space. As he began pulling weeds from around the roses Sarah had planted for their 10th anniversary, he found himself remembering not the sadness of her absence, but the happiness of their shared labor. The work felt meditative in a way that reminded him of the ceremony in the crystal cave. Each weed removed was like releasing another piece of the pain he had been carrying. Each plant freed from overgrowth was like discovering something beautiful that had been hidden beneath his grief. The gloves seemed to guide his hands toward the work that needed doing, as if Sarah's knowledge of this garden lived on in the worn leather. As the weeks passed, the garden became Marcus's primary meditation practice. He spent early mornings and late afternoons working in the soil, wearing Sarah's gloves and following the patterns she had established years before. But gradually, he began making changes that reflected his own understanding of what the space could become. He planted herbs that attracted butterflies, created a small seating area where he could drink coffee in the morning light, and established a section specifically dedicated to plants that could be harvested and shared with neighbors. The transformation of the garden paralleled the transformation in his own life. Where Sarah had focused on beauty and personal enjoyment, Marcus found himself drawn toward utility and community connection. He began growing extra vegetables to donate to the local food bank, started propagating perennials to give away to friends who were struggling with their own losses, and created herb bundles that he could offer to people who needed the kind of healing that came from working with growing things. Mrs. Chen from next door was his first regular visitor. She had lost her husband the previous winter and had been struggling with depression that left her unable to care for her own small garden. Marcus invited her to help with his vegetable beds, and they began spending quiet hours working side by side, rarely talking but finding comfort in shared purpose. The work seemed to restore something in both of them, a connection to cycles of growth and renewal that transcended individual loss. The gloves became his most treasured tool, more valuable than any of the expensive implements that filled the garden shed. They connected him not just to Sarah's memory, but to her ongoing influence on the way he moved through the world. When he wore them, he felt guided by her understanding of what it meant to nurture growth, to create beauty, to tend something with patience and love until it flourished. One evening, as Marcus was harvesting tomatoes to deliver to a recently widowed colleague, he realized that the garden had become another form of the sacred space he had discovered in the mountain cave. It was a place where transformation happened slowly and naturally, where people could come to heal without dramatic ritual or ceremonial intensity. The gloves were his connection to that sacred purpose, a reminder that healing could happen through simple acts of caring for growing things. As autumn approached and the garden's first season under his sole care drew to a close, Marcus found himself planning for next year's planting with an excitement he hadn't felt about anything since Sarah's death. The gloves had taught him that love could be cultivated like any growing thing, tended with patience and attention until it bore fruit that could nourish others. The blank notebook arrived in Marcus's mailbox 6 months after his return from the mountain, with no return address and no explanation for how the sender had known he would need it. The notebook was simple, but beautiful, bound in the same kind of soft leather as the journal he had found in the shelter. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the kind that would accept ink gracefully and hold words for decades without fading. Most remarkably, it was completely empty, free of the mysterious entries that had so unsettled him during his time in the wilderness. This was a journal waiting to be filled with his own story, rather than reflecting impossible knowledge of his past. Marcus found it on a Tuesday evening in November, nestled between utility bills and grocery store advertisements. There was no postmark, no shipping label, just his name written across a small envelope in the same flowing script that had filled the shelter's journal. Inside the envelope was a single sentence: "For the stories you will help others write." That night, he sat at his kitchen table with the notebook open before him, unsure how to begin. The blank pages seemed to hold infinite possibility, but also a weight of responsibility that felt both exciting and daunting. Finally, he wrote a simple first entry. "Today I helped Tom Rodriguez plan his wife's memorial service. He hadn't been able to think about it until now, 6 months after her death. We talked about what she loved most, and he decided to hold it in their backyard garden instead of a funeral home." The act of writing felt different from anything Marcus had experienced before. During his academic career, writing had been about documenting research findings and communicating complex geological concepts. This was something else entirely. This was about bearing witness to the small moments of transformation that occurred when people began to heal from profound loss. Over the following weeks, the notebook became Marcus's companion in a new kind of work that had evolved naturally from his experience in the mountains. Word had spread through their small community about his willingness to sit with people who were struggling with grief, and he found himself invited into increasingly intimate moments of other people's healing journeys. He wrote about Margaret Stevens, who had finally been able to clean out her deceased son's bedroom after Marcus spent an afternoon helping her sort through boxes of childhood treasures. He documented his conversations with Father Miguel, the parish priest who was struggling with his own faith. After losing 3 parishioners in a car accident and needed someone to listen without offering easy theological answers, each entry in the notebook captured not just the facts of these encounters, but the subtle signs of transformation that Marcus had learned to recognize. The moment when someone's posture shifted from defensive to open. The first time they mentioned their lost loved one without immediately beginning to cry. The day they started talking about future plans instead of only dwelling on past memories. The notebook also became a place where Marcus could reflect on his own continuing journey. He wrote about the dreams, where Sarah appeared not as the sick woman from her final months, but as the vibrant partner he had known for most of their marriage. He documented the gradually diminishing pain of encountering their special places around town, and the growing sense that he was building something meaningful from the foundation of their love. Most importantly, the notebook helped him recognize patterns in the healing process that he might have missed otherwise. He began to see that grief followed certain rhythms, that healing happened in predictable stages, even though each person's timeline was unique. The written record helped him become more skillful at recognizing where someone was in their journey and what kind of support they might need most. One entry, written on a particularly clear December evening, captured the essence of what the notebook had taught him. "Today, I realize that everyone who finds their way to me is really looking for the same thing I found in that mountain shelter. They need someone to witness their pain without trying to fix it, someone to sit with them while they remember how to hope, someone to help them understand that love doesn't end with death, but transforms into something that can serve others." The notebook had become more than just a record of his activities. It was a map of the territory of healing, charted through his own experience and the experiences of those he had been privileged to accompany. Each page contained evidence that Sarah's final gift had been not just his own transformation, but his capacity to facilitate transformation in others. As winter deepened and the first anniversary of his mountain journey approached, Marcus found himself writing plans for the year ahead. There were people who might benefit from the kind of intensive healing experience he had found in the sacred cave. others who needed the gentler medicine of garden work and patient conversation. The blank notebook had become a tool for designing a life of service that honored both his own healing and Sarah's continuing influence on the way he moved through the world. The wooden hiking staff appeared on Marcus's front porch on the morning of the first anniversary of his mountain journey, carved from what looked like the same aspen wood as the compass that had guided him to the shelter's hidden chamber. Marcus found it leaning against his front door when he stepped outside to collect the newspaper, positioned as if someone had just finished using it and decided to rest it there for a moment. The staff was beautifully crafted, standing roughly chest-high and worn smooth by years of handling. Along its length, someone had carved a spiral pattern of symbols that looked similar to the markings he had seen in the sacred cave, each one representing what appeared to be a different stage of a spiritual journey. At the top of the staff, instead of a conventional handle, was a piece of carved crystal that caught the morning light and threw it back in gentle rainbows. The crystal was the same clear quartz he remembered from the altar where his healing ceremony had taken place, somehow transported from that sacred space to this ordinary suburban doorstep. When Marcus lifted the staff, it felt perfectly balanced in his hands, as if it had been carved specifically for his height and grip. There was no note this time, no cryptic message or explanation for how the staff had arrived. But Marcus understood immediately what it represented. This was his invitation to return to the mountain, not as someone seeking healing, but as someone prepared to guide others through the same transformation he had experienced. The timing felt significant. Over the past year, he had helped dozens of people in his community work through various stages of grief and loss. But there had been a few individuals whose pain seemed too deep for the gentle interventions of garden work and patient conversation. These were people who, like him a year ago, needed something more dramatic than gradual healing. They needed the kind of intensive spiritual experience that could only happen in a place deliberately set aside for transformation. Maria Santos had been the first person Marcus identified as needing this deeper intervention. Her teenage son had died in a hiking accident 6 months earlier, and despite therapy and medication and the support of her family, she remained trapped in a grief so profound it seemed to be consuming her. She had stopped eating regularly, stopped sleeping through the night, stopped engaging with the activities and relationships that had once given her life meaning. David Fletcher was another. His partner of 20 years had died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving David not only devastated by loss, but struggling with legal and social challenges that their unmarried status had created. His grief was complicated by anger at systems that hadn't recognized their relationship, and by regret over decisions they had postponed until it was too late. Both Maria and David had reached the point where conventional support felt inadequate. They needed the kind of complete environmental change that could break through the patterns of thought and behavior that were keeping them trapped in despair. They needed to discover that healing was possible even when loss felt absolute. Marcus spent the day after finding the staff preparing for what felt like a calling rather than simply a hiking trip. He studied Ezra's hand-drawn map, refreshing his memory of the route to the sacred shelter. He gathered supplies not just for himself, but for the people he might guide to the mountain. Most importantly, he spent time in meditation with the staff, learning to sense the wisdom it seemed to contain. The carved symbols along its length told their own story. At the bottom, near where his hand naturally rested, were images that represented loss and disorientation. Moving upward, the symbols showed increasingly complex patterns that seemed to represent the stages of transformation he had experienced in the cave. At the top, near the crystal, were symbols that looked like figures helping other figures, suggesting that the ultimate purpose of the journey was to develop the capacity to serve others. When Marcus called Maria and David to invite them on what he described as a special kind of wilderness retreat, both responded with immediate interest. Something in his voice Perhaps the confidence that came from carrying the staff convinced them that this wasn't just another well-meaning attempt to cheer them up. This was an invitation to something that might actually change their relationship with their loss. The staff felt different in his hands than any hiking equipment he had ever used. Where his old compass had been a tool for navigation, this was an instrument for guidance of a different kind. It was a symbol of his readiness to help others find their way through the wilderness of grief, toward the possibility of transformed understanding as Marcus prepared for the journey that would take him back to Ezra and the sacred cave. He understood that the staff represented his graduation from student to teacher in the ancient tradition of healing that the mountain had preserved for centuries. The braided rope that Ezra handed to Marcus was unlike any climbing equipment he had ever seen, woven from what appeared to be natural fibers and blessed with the kind of strength that came from more than just physical durability. Marcus, Maria, and David had reached the shelter after a 2-day journey that had tested all 3 of them in different ways. Maria had struggled with the physical demands of mountain hiking, her grief-weakened body unaccustomed to sustained effort. David had battled anxiety attacks that struck whenever the trail reminded him of hiking trips he had taken with his deceased partner. But both had persevered, driven by something deeper than mere determination. Ezra greeted them at the shelter as if he had been expecting their arrival, which Marcus realized he probably had. The old mountain man's ability to sense when lost souls were approaching had been honed over 40 years of practice. He welcomed Maria and David with the same gentle authority he had shown Marcus a year earlier, immediately putting them at ease despite the strangeness of their situation. "Before we begin the ceremony," Ezra said, producing the rope from somewhere in his seemingly endless collection of handmade tools, "you need to understand what binds you together." The rope was perhaps 20 feet long, braided in a complex pattern that created a surface both beautiful and functional. As Marcus examined it more closely, he could see that it was woven from multiple types of natural fiber. Some strands appeared to be hemp, others looked like sinew, and still others seemed to be plant fibers he couldn't identify. The overall effect was of something that had been created not just for utility, but as a work of art. "This rope has been used in healing ceremonies for longer than anyone can remember," Ezra explained, beginning to demonstrate how the 3 of them should position themselves. "It represents the connections that persist even when death appears to have severed them. Tonight, you will each hold a section while you tell your stories. The rope will help you understand that your individual grief is part of a larger pattern of love and loss." Maria took her position first, wrapping the rope around her wrists in the pattern Ezra showed her. As she began to speak about her son Diego, about his love for adventure and his death in a climbing accident that had happened less than 50 miles from where they now sat, Marcus could see how the physical connection to the others helped stabilize her emotionally. The rope seemed to anchor her to something larger than her individual pain. David spoke next, his section of the rope taut between his hands as he described his 20-year relationship with James, the sudden heart attack that had taken him without warning, and the legal and social complications that had made grief even more difficult to navigate. As his story unfolded, Marcus noticed how the rope seemed to carry tension and release it, as if the physical object was helping to distribute the emotional weight among the 3 of them. When Marcus's turn came, he found himself telling not just the story of Sarah's death, but the story of his journey to healing. He spoke about the shelter, the journal, the ceremony in the crystal cave, and the year of service that had followed. As he spoke, he could feel how the rope connected his experience to theirs, creating a circuit of understanding that made their individual stories part of a larger narrative about love's persistence beyond death. "The rope teaches us that grief shared is grief transformed," Ezra said when all 3 had finished speaking. "When you carry sorrow alone, it becomes a weight that can crush you. When you allow others to help bear that weight, it becomes something different. It becomes wisdom that can serve others. The evening that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced during his own healing ceremony. Where his transformation had been intensely solitary, this ritual was fundamentally communal. The three of them remained connected by the rope throughout the night, sharing not just their stories but their dreams, their fears, and their tentative hopes for futures that might include joy again. By morning, something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of their losses. Maria spoke about Diego not as someone who had been taken from her, but as someone whose love for adventure lived on in her own willingness to undertake this mountain journey. David described James not as absent, but as present in a different form, his influence visible in the compassion David now felt for others who were struggling with unrecognized relationships. The rope had taught them that healing didn't require forgetting or moving on. It required recognizing that love created connections that transcended individual loss, bonds that could be strengthened rather than broken by the experience of profound grief. When they finally released their hold on the braided fibers, all three understood that they would carry those connections with them for the rest of their lives. The carved prayer stone was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, but it carried the weight of countless hopes and intentions left by those who had found healing in the sacred mountain shelter. Ezra presented it to Marcus on their final morning together, as Maria and David prepared for the journey back to their transformed lives below. The stone was smooth granite, worn by decades of handling, with symbols carved into its surface that seemed to shift and change depending on how the light struck them. Some of the markings were clearly ancient, etched by hands that had worked this stone long before Ezra had become its guardian. Others looked more recent, added by people who had undergone the healing ceremony and wanted to leave something of their experience behind. Every person who completes the transformation adds their mark to this stone, Ezra explained, turning the granite piece in his weathered hands. It becomes a record of all the healing that has happened in this place, all the love that has been transformed from personal loss into universal service. Marcus could see his own symbol among the newer carvings, a simple representation of two interlocking circles that he had etched during his ceremony a year ago. At the time, it had represented his marriage to Sarah, the way their lives had become so intertwined that her death had left him feeling incomplete. Now, looking at those circles in the context of all the other symbols, he understood them differently. They represented not just his relationship with Sarah, but his connection to everyone who had walked this path of transformation. Maria and David each added their own symbols to the stone during a brief ceremony that completed their healing ritual. Maria carved a small mountain peak, representing both Diego's love of climbing and her own journey to this place of understanding. David chose interlocking hands, symbolizing not just his relationship with James, but his newfound ability to reach out to others who were struggling with loss and social isolation. As they prepared to leave the shelter, Ezra placed the prayer stone in Marcus's hands with a solemnity that made clear this was more than just a temporary loan. "This is yours now," he said. "Take it back to your community. Let it help others. Understand that healing is possible, that transformation can happen even when loss feels absolute." The weight of the stone felt different from any geological specimen Marcus had ever handled during his career. This granite held not just the mineral history of the mountain, but the emotional history of everyone who had touched it during their journey from despair to hope. It was a tangible connection to the sacred tradition he had now become part of, a physical reminder of his responsibility to continue the work of helping others find their way through grief. During the descent from the mountain, Marcus found himself reaching for the stone whenever the trail became difficult or when Maria and David needed encouragement to continue. The simple act of touching the carved surface seemed to connect him to the wisdom of everyone who had walked this path before them, lending him confidence in his new role as a guide and healer. Back in his community, the prayer stone became the centerpiece of informal gatherings Marcus began hosting in his home. People who were struggling with loss would hold the stone while sharing their stories, each one adding their touch to the accumulated energy of healing it contained. The granite seemed to absorb their pain and reflect back something transformed, something that acknowledged their suffering while pointing toward the possibility of growth beyond it. Mrs. Chen was among the first to benefit from the stone's power. During a particularly difficult evening when memories of her deceased husband threatened to overwhelm her, she held the carved granite and spoke about her fear that forgetting his voice would mean losing him entirely. As she talked, running her fingers over the symbols left by others who had faced similar fears, she began to understand that memory could evolve without diminishing love. Father Miguel found solace in the stone during his ongoing struggle with faith after losing 3 parishioners. The accumulated intentions carved into its surface helped him recognize that doubt and belief could coexist, that questioning his faith was part of a deeper spiritual journey rather than evidence of failure. The stone also served as a bridge between Marcus's work in the community and the sacred tradition he had inherited from the mountain. When he encountered someone whose grief seemed too deep for conventional support, he would let them hold the prayer stone and see if its energy resonated with their need for transformation. Those who responded to its power often found themselves ready for the journey to the shelter, while others discovered that simply connecting with the stone's accumulated healing energy was enough to begin their own process of recovery. As winter approached and Marcus reflected on the year that had passed since his first return from the mountain, he realized that the prayer stone had become more than just a tool for helping others. It had become a reminder of his own continuing transformation, evidence that healing was not a destination but an ongoing journey of service to others who were walking the same difficult path. The silver locket arrived on Marcus's kitchen table on a quiet Sunday morning in early spring, 2 years after his first journey to the mountain shelter, appearing as mysteriously as all the other artifacts that had guided his transformation. He found it beside his coffee cup when he returned from his morning walk through the neighborhood, a delicate piece of jewelry that seemed to glow with its own inner light in the gentle sunbeam streaming through the window. The locket was clearly antique, its silver surface etched with intricate patterns that reminded him of the symbols carved into the prayer stone. A fine chain lay coiled beside it, suggesting it was meant to be worn rather than simply admired. Inside the locket, Marcus discovered 2 small photographs. One showed Sarah in her garden, wearing the blue jacket she had loved, her face lit with the quiet joy she had always found in nurturing growing things. But this wasn't a photograph Marcus remembered taking. The angle and lighting suggested it had been captured by someone else, someone who had observed Sarah during one of her secret visits to prepare for Marcus's healing journey. The second photograph showed Marcus himself, taken some time during the past year as he worked with someone in his own garden. He was kneeling beside Mrs. Chen, both of them tending to the herb beds he had planted for their healing work together. The image captured something Marcus had never seen in photographs of himself before, a quality of peaceful purpose that spoke of someone who had found his calling in service to others. Together, the 2 photographs told a story of continuity, of love that had transformed from one form into another without losing its essential nature. Sarah's nurturing spirit lived on in Marcus's work with grieving members of their community. Her gift for creating spaces where growth could happen reflected in his gift for creating opportunities where healing could occur. As Marcus fastened the locket around his neck, he felt a completion that he hadn't known he was seeking, The chain settled against his chest with a comfortable weight, positioning the silver pendant directly over his heart. For the first time, since beginning his journey of transformation, he felt that he was carrying both his past and his future in perfect balance. The locket became his constant companion during the months that followed. He wore it during the quiet morning hours when he wrote in his journal, documenting the ongoing stories of people he was helping through their grief. He felt its presence. During the informal healing circles that had grown from his initial work with the prayer stone, when neighbors gathered to share their struggles and find support in community connection. Most importantly, he wore the locket during his regular returns to the mountain shelter, journeys he now made several times each year to guide others through the intensive healing ceremony that had saved his own life. The silver pendant served as a bridge between the sacred space of the mountain and the ordinary world where the real work of transformation happened day by day. On one particularly meaningful trip, Marcus found himself guiding a young widow named Elena, whose husband had died in military service overseas. As she underwent her own ceremony in the crystal cave, holding the same medicine bundle that had facilitated Marcus's healing 2 years earlier, he touched the locket and felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him. The experience helped him understand that the locket represented more than just memory or sentiment. It was a symbol of his role as a bridge between those who had completed their earthly journey and those who were still learning how to transform loss into service. Sarah's love continued to work in the world through his hands. Her wisdom continued to guide others through his words. Her nurturing spirit continued to create spaces for healing through his efforts. As the seasons turned and Marcus's work expanded, to include training others in the gentle arts of grief support, the locket reminded him that he was part of an ancient tradition that would continue long after his own time had passed. Future generations would find their way to the mountain shelter when they needed intensive healing, would discover the prayer stone when they needed community support, would learn from guides who had themselves been guided through the transformation from despair to hope. The silver locket caught the light as Marcus stood in his garden on the 2nd anniversary of Sarah's death, no longer a day of overwhelming sorrow, but a celebration of love's persistence beyond individual life. Around him, the flowers, Sarah, had planted bloomed alongside the herbs he had added, creating a living symbol of how new growth could emerge from careful tending of what had come before. In his pocket, the carved prayer stone rested warm from the touch of the latest person who had found comfort in its accumulated healing energy. In his heart, the love that had begun with Sarah continued to expand, reaching out to embrace everyone who needed help, remembering that transformation was possible, that healing could happen, that love never truly ended but simply changed form to serve a larger purpose.